I will say that I'm a San Antonio native, and I grew up in San Antonio, but I went ahead and went to New York City, I guess this was 15 years ago. So I've lived in New York City for 15 years. And I went to pursue my passion, which was social justice, learning about policy and how to affect change in different kinds of communities. So I'm making my way back, and I'm hoping to visit San Antonio much more often. But I hope that the perspectives and experiences that I've had will be useful to you today. And also, I want to say that I went ahead and selected a case study that I thought you would find relevant because it takes place in Texas. I do have a lot of experience in New York City as well. So after the presentation, if you have questions about anything that has to do with advocacy or other experiences I may have had in New York City and in different spheres, please feel free to ask me. I'm very willing to answer any questions you may have. I want this to be an engaging, very vivid, and interactive learning experience. So at any point, if you have a burning question, please feel free to ask it. So let's begin. Welcome. It doesn't come out very clearly, but that's actually here. It's the Virgen de Guadalupe with Juan Diego. I think that's in the back in one of the chapels. And I think how relevant, because I think La Virgen de Guadalupe was used a lot, like in the Mexican Revolution. Cesar Chavez would use it as he would mobilize people and community to rise up for social justice. Very, very appropriate. So today's overview, what we're going to be talking about is, first of all, our foundation, our personal foundations. Second, our cause. And third, strengthening our work. And these are the learning objectives for today. You will be able to identify your values and worldviews. You'll reframe adversity to resilience. You'll explore new advocacy planning models and discuss advocacy implementation. I just want to make sure, Scott, where's my assistant? Oh, Lupita's right there. Okay. I just want to make sure you're here. Her name's Lupita too. That's awesome. Okay. So for our foundation, the first section of this presentation. We didn't choose the moment in which to come to this world. Now we can create the world in which the seed that we brought with us can be birthed and flourished. I love that quote. So let's visit for a moment history, or herstory. What shapes and defines us? And how do we not lose sight of it? I'm going to take you through a little bit of storytelling on the things that shaped and defined me. So we're going to start as early as 1950s. Don't worry, I'm not going to go year by year of all these decades. But I thought it was important to start to talk about things that shaped me. So this is in the early 1950s. This is my mom and dad. This was in Mexico, and they were just dating here. They're probably in their early 20s. And what I want to share with you about my parents is they were amazing. I think they're the reason I'm still not married. They set the bar really high. I'm really serious. It's really interesting, too. I just came across this photo just a few years ago. I hadn't seen it when I was younger, but my sister says, you know, I would always hear stories about my parents and how they only went to the second grade because they were very poor. And my father had to work to help support his brothers and sisters and parents, so everybody worked. So I remember looking at this photo. Oh, and the same thing for my mom. She only went to the second grade as well. And I remember when this photo popped up, and so many other photos, I told my sister, they're dressed so nice. They look great, and they were poor. Like, how does that happen? But, you know, I'm reminded that those were different times. There was a lot to be said about dignity. I know my mother would always tell me to always respect yourself. So even if you have just 2 dresses, you wear them well. And that just shows respect for yourself and others. So my dad was the same way. And another thing that I found very special about my parents is that my dad, well, before he dated my mother, he asked around first and did research, asking neighbors, oh, what do you know about that cute lady? And so he asked about what's her family like, what's her family situation, what is she like, before he even approached her. And then my mother says that she didn't even want to date him because her sister kept telling him, oh, he's too short. So if you can see, they're exactly the same height. On their wedding portrait, he had to use a little step stool because she had heels on. So they were very cute. And my mother was actually my father's very first and last girlfriend. And I would ask my mom, what about you, Mom? She's like, oh, chorros. I had a lot of boyfriends before your dad. So they're really cute. I still admire them. They're amazing. Okay. So the late 1950s. So my dad came to the United States for typical immigrant story, wanted a better future, better life. He found that in Mexico, he was working about 3-4 jobs, barely making it. My mom had just had 2 babies. That's my brother sitting down, and that's my sister standing. Those are the 2 oldest in our family of the 5, and that's my cousin holding a doll. So when they came to the States, they were poor, still poor. Those were the projects. They lived here. This is in San Antonio, the Apache courts. So my mom tells me that she remembers my dad would be like, one day we're gonna be so comfortable. I'm gonna be making good money for us. And she'd be like, that's okay. Yes, dear. Yes, dear. She really didn't believe it. But she also said that one thing she really admired about my dad is that everything that he would say, he'd follow through with. So his word was golden. But she thought he just had very high hopes when he would talk about, you know, doing very well. 1965, against all odds. These 2 individuals had had 2nd grade education, didn't know English, were newcomers to San Antonio, were newcomers to the country, had children, had been living in the projects. My father, I said he had worked many jobs in Mexico. When he came to San Antonio, he continued. He worked as a waiter for what was called at the time Apaches, Café. And he also worked at a meat market. He also worked as a bus driver. He had different kinds of jobs. But one day, the owner of this restaurant told him, if you'd like to own the restaurant, we can make an arrangement. You can make me installments, payments, monthly installments, until you pay the full amount, and the restaurant will be yours. Are you kidding? My father's like, yes, I'll do it, of course. So he was so excited. He got home and he's like, oh my gosh, guess what? He tells my mom, and my mom's still like, really? Still not totally sure about it, but he's like, yes, I'm gonna be working really hard now and trying to make all the payments. Okay, so the payments begin. What my father starts noticing is that 3rd month in, the payment doubles, the amount doubles for which he has to pay. The month after that, it triples. It got to the point where he was thinking, I don't know how I'm gonna make the next month payment. And the thing is, if I don't make that payment, the agreement is no longer valid. So he didn't want to lose the restaurant. So my dad was very, how can I say, charming and just warm. People just gravitated to him all the time. He had already made a lot of friends as a waiter at the restaurant. So he just started to talk to people and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I want to buy this place. This is my dream. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. I may cry a little bit sometimes, but bear with me. It's just very moving. So I feel like this was the very first example that I can remember of true advocacy. He wasn't telling people, I need money. He was telling them, this is my dream. So what started to happen is he started to approach his closest friends or the people that he felt closest to and confiding in them, this is my dream, I want to buy this restaurant, this would mean so much. So they lent him the money. They were like, sure. The following months, as I tell you, the amounts kept increasing. So they started to also help him appeal to other customers and other people they knew to help him make the next month's rent or payment. So what was happening is there was this cycle where he'd borrow money for a month to pay the original lenders, to pay the next, and then make the payment. So I don't know how many times over this happened, but finally, he bought the restaurant. The man that was the owner, his name is Rogelio González, no relation, was furious. Turns out, he had been doing this to all immigrants coming for years, and he would just keep their money once they broke the agreement. He was shocked and upset. And another thing I remember my sister telling me is that when my father worked at the restaurant, this was back in the 60s, there was still a lot of discrimination, overt discrimination. A lot of the businesses in downtown San Antonio actually had signs that said no Mexicans allowed, no blacks allowed, whites only. Los Apaches Café had a sign that said no blacks allowed. The first thing my dad did when he became owner is he took that sign down and he said to my mom, the only color I'm considering or really concerned about is green. So, yes. So he took the sign down. So this was it. This was my dad's big break. After this man started owning and buying property and businesses. So this was the very huge big break that my dad got. So, and my mom helped him. She would go to work with my dad, especially in the beginning. And they were still very happy. They never lost their romance. After 5 children, they still were so cute together. Every time he'd come home, I remember I would be the first one to run, give him a kiss, and then of course he'd go to my mom, kiss. But it was always very warm and loving. I remember he'd be asking about her day. Very sweet. So, I don't know if you guys knew, but Los Apaches Café was San Antonio's oldest Mexican restaurant, 1927. I'm curious, have any of you heard of Los Apaches Café? Oh, okay, good. Have any of you been? It's downtown, right next to the Spanish governor's palace. Used to be. Yes.
I have to share with you that as a child, I would meet there with my dad. My dad had meat markets, and we would be burritos, and we would be there.
Oh my goodness, that's awesome. That's really great. Anyone else have stories of going to Los Apaches Café? Yes. The caldo. Oh, I have a funny story about the caldo. You want to hear it? Okay. So I remember I was a little girl, and I must have been about 4 years old. And during Fiesta Week, oh my God, we'd always get drunk people. And one day there was this really drunk old man, and he comes in, and he's like, just, yelling. And he's like, "Ay, yo quiero caldo." Like, very like he's gonna start a war or something. Or my dad's like, okay, we'll get you your caldo. Sit down. So he sits down, and they bring the caldo out. I used to love to roll the tortilla and the corn tortilla. Anyway, so he's sitting down with his caldo, and then he takes a couple sips, and then he starts saying, "Este caldo está frío como hielo. This soup is cold like ice. What kind of service is this? This is terrible food." On and on and on. He would not stop. And my dad was just like biting his tongue. And then the customers were getting, annoyed because he was very loud. So my dad, I could tell my dad was angry when he would start to get red. So he was getting red. And then he took a deep breath. And finally he walks over to the gentleman. "Let me see your hand." And he says, "The soup is hot? It's cold?" And he's like, "Yes, it's so cold. It's very cold." So he's like, and he dunks his hand in, and then he's like, "Ah! It's hot, you burned me." And he's like, "Well, I thought it was cold." That was funny. Everybody laughed. So, my dad had fun there, too. But what I want to say about this also is that Los Apaches was our family's bread and butter. It definitely gave us financial security. So that was a huge achievement for my family, for my parents that had been poor basically most of their life. And as a result, I was able to go to some good schools. Yay! So the San Antonio schools I attended was starting at kindergarten at Redeemer Lutheran School. And there I learned about, Lutheran religion. We memorized the Martin Luther Catechism. And it was my first time, because all my life before then, I was around Mexicans, right? My family's Mexican. A lot of the people that would go to the restaurant were Mexican, cousins. I only spoke Spanish. I didn't know English. So my first day at school, I had no idea what anybody was saying. It was really scary. I remember not knowing a word anybody was saying. If Sally in front of me stood up, I would sit up too. I wasn't sure what was going on. I remember not knowing English, and then I remember just suddenly knowing it. I don't remember struggling with it. And I did notice also there was a formality in which people communicated. So I learned that too. Although it was more of a formal culture, it was still very loving. And I felt it. And I knew that the teachers there really cared about me and wanted me to learn. Is anybody here familiar with Redeemer Lutheran? It's not there anymore. I think it's a tech school now, on Fredericksburg and Fresno, something like that. Okay. Then I went to Incarnate Word High School. That was Catholic school. There were a lot of nuns. And that was a slightly different culture, a little more mixed. There were a lot of rules, lots of rules. And I want to point out and emphasize that both at Redeemer and at Incarnate Word that I really learned about benevolence and caring for others and how important it is to, if someone is in need, to help them, right? I mean, that was just something you learned through and through attending those schools. And then I went to Thomas Jefferson High School. Wait, has anyone here attended Incarnate Word? Yay, high five. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Thomas Jefferson High School, I know there's one here. Anyone from Thomas Jefferson High School? Cool. So Leroy and I went to school together, so hadn't seen him in like over 20 years. It's good to see you, thank you for coming. And at Thomas Jefferson High School, how would you describe Jeff? culture and like your experience at Jeff, I guess.
I mean, it was a wonderful school. It was, I'd say there's a lot of demographics there when I went there. We went at a time where you could find every type of student, every type of teacher. I graduated with the Castro brothers, which you all know have gone into politics. A lot of business owners, restaurant owners here in town, business owners, and it was just a good group of kids. It got a bad rap during that time, but if you went there, you loved it. And it was a really good school for just about everybody.
One of the things too I remember, Leroy, is speech debate team, right? That's how we met too. And you were involved with like musicals and plays. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a theatrical school now.
Yeah.
You know, there's schools like that, but the architecture was second to none at that school. If you've ever been inside the theater,
Yes.
It's beautiful, almost like a majestic downtown. So it's a gorgeous school with a lot of history.
It is. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. One of the things I learned at Jeff when we were going to school there is, because I was in the speech and debate team, we were, and I learned how to speak even though you're afraid. So that was a very good lesson, which came in handy, which you will see later how it came in handy. And then I graduated. That's me and my mama. So, yeah, I think she felt very proud, given her entire journey and mine at that point. Okay, where's my assistant? Okay. What kind of, from the stories that I've told you already, what kind of cultural values or familial values can you say are a part of me, given what I've told you? You can just blurt anything out. What is that?
Hard work.
Hard work, yes. Appreciation. Adaptability.
Perseverance.
Why adaptability and why perseverance?
Because we were able to let up
Right. Right.
And perseverance because you made multiple adjustments from the culture you knew to the culture you were taking on. And you had the example of your parents' perseverance in working through the issue with the restaurant and all of that.
Anyone else?
having dreams and goals.
Right. Right.
Pride.
How so? Right. Yes.
I don't know the word for it, but in the face of exploitation, they followed up and give up.
Right. I want to add to that. You know, when I told you the story about him saying, the only color I'm concerned about is green. He came from Mexico. Mexico, I don't think is so hung up on, are you black or are you white? Or other, what are you? I guess it's more classist, right? But as far as like the race thing, it's not really, you know, we're obsessed with it. But Mexico's not so much, I don't think. It may be like, there might be some discrimination around if you're darker complected, lighter, but the race line is not. So I don't even know if my dad really thought in those terms. It just wasn't in his mindset because of where he came.
I think he was more of a business person, so like you're saying, he was interested in the bottom line. He wasn't necessarily interested in who would be concerned with the customers coming in and out.
Right, right. I want to add too that I sometimes do Spanish interpreting for some New York City top law firms that focus on pro bono work for political asylum. And a lot of the people that come from Latin America So the application for political asylum, one of the questions is, what's your race? Every single one, when I ask, what's your race? They go, what do you mean? What? They can't answer it. I say that just to challenge you a bit, that our reality is just our reality. It's not the same for everyone else. Okay, thank you for being patient, assistant. I'm gonna hand out, or actually Scott's gonna hand out. Let's see. I have 50 here, but I don't think there's, okay, so, okay. So, I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes. Just read the top part. It's double-sided, but we don't need the back until later. And I'm gonna be quiet for about 8 minutes. As you read, I want you to think about a couple more values that you see as you read it. The other one. Here, let me show. The story, yeah, read the story. Not the values, the story. I was gonna have you guys break into a group, but we're gonna do that in just after a couple more slides. Worldview. So I want you guys to know worldview is the framework of ideas and beliefs forming a global description through which an individual, group, or culture watches and interprets the world and interacts with it. Make sense? Okay. Isak Dinesen. This worldview is, if only I could so live and so serve the world that after me, there should never again be bird in cages. What values are speaking there? What values speak there?
Liberation.
Freedom. Anything else? Service? How so?
Well, it says not only do I live, but I'm a servant
That's right.
in a special way.
Right. Yes. I also see compassion, right? A bird's a very small thing, but she's like, what? Advocacy for life. Yes. Great. Cesar Chavez. History will judge societies and governments and their institutions, not by how big they are or how well they serve the rich and the powerful, but by how effectively they respond to the needs of the poor and the helpless. Values there? Compassion, yes. Benevolence, compassion. Jorge Ramos, worldview. One of the war's greatest injustices is that those doing the fighting are generally not the same people who are giving the orders to fight. If all presidents who initiate a war were required to have children on the front lines, how many wars would there be? That's also compassion. Sanctity of life. Bell hooks. Dominator culture has tried to keep us all afraid, to make us choose safety instead of risk, sameness instead of diversity. Moving through that fear, finding out what connects us, reveling in our differences, this is the process that brings us closer, that gives us a world of shared values, of meaningful community. Che Guevara's worldview. The true revolutionary is guided by sentiments of love most sincere. Malala. I believe in equality, and I believe that there's no difference between a man and a woman. I even believe that a woman is more powerful than man. Okay. Group work. You ready? Each table, I'm going to give you a total of 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, to discuss what your values are, what brought you to your work in advocacy, what your worldview is. Okay. All right. So I'm going to want to hear from a couple of you. Scott's going to walk around with a microphone. If there's someone that would like to share something that they discovered, or they just want to share about worldview, maybe what they learned about someone else in the group. Scott? Okay. Here's a microphone.
I just, wow, this is good. No, I just noticed listening to everybody in our group that the main source was compassion.
Oh.
That was the driving force for everybody's field, is that they loved really what they're doing, because it was a driving force that brought them from their past to bring them here to affect the worldview. So
Beautiful.
it's neat.
Compassion. Who else?
I'm good.
We definitely all have a desire to help someone in a different capacity, but the commonality is that we're all compassionate, like she said, but it may look different for each and every one of us. So we're all, passionate and compassionate about something, but it's different.
Good observation. Yeah? Yes, Leroy?
I think that with us, it seemed like the commonality was that I think we all have it in us, like you said, compassion, but I think also our environment and our experiences is it's a good marriage of the two that have allowed us to kind of focus into those areas, whether you choose to do nonprofit or you choose to do any type of customer service or whatever it is. It's kind of like it's in you, it's innate, but it's also the experiences that we've had in our lives that focus us in what direction.
Very good. Yeah.
The other observation that we kind of saw was that those things, that compassion and that passion have been modeled for us, a lot of us, by our parents. And so it's sort of a gift that they've given us. And so, I think that is something to think about, how not everybody has parents like that.
Yes.
Why we ended up here is that commonality.
That is very true. We are lucky, the ones that, of us that experience good parenting. Yes?
And I think that for myself personally, having had that experience with my parents, it made me very acutely aware of how important it was to model that, not to try to teach it to my children, but to model it, to just live it, so that they might become individuals who would be servants, who would have a servant's heart, and just have it be second nature. They don't think about it.
Beautiful. That leads,
And just one thing.
Yes.
Because we are recording, I am going to ask y'all to use the mic if you're going to talk, because that way we won't have dead space. Thanks.
can you repeat that? Because it was beautiful and it's going to be the segue. No pressure.
I just know that in growing my children, that it was something that was really important for me, not to try to teach them to do, but actually to model it every day, to have a servant's heart, and that be something that was second nature, not something, that they even thought about. very important to me. And Jake is 18 and Mika is 17, and I'm seeing it, little slivers of it. And I'm very pleased. I'm happy and hopeful.
Very good. Thank you. That beautifully leads us to our values, worldviews, they define us, and our causes, and the way that we show up in the world. So our values are important because that's the core of who we are. Our values inform how we feel about things that happen, which then informs our thoughts, which inform our behavior, which informs our character over time, which inspires the goals that we set and the way that we impact the world, whether we're aware of it or not. And I have to give credit for this visual. There was a little girl last year that I met in the New York City subway who was selling her works of art. I bought it for $1. But I thought it was beautiful. Right? Our thoughts become words, and then our words become our action, and then our action becomes our character, and then our character informs our destiny. Brilliant little girl. She must have been about 7 or 8. I hope she's doing well. Okay, next section, our cause. History in and of itself is not the past. It is the stories that we tell about the past. How we tell these stories, triumphantly or self-critically, metaphysically or dialectically, has a lot to do with whether we cut short or advance our evolution as human beings. I want you to read this on your own. I'll read it out loud. On October 23rd, 1992, the Texas Tech University Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity held their annual social event, Party in the Projects. Members donned KKK apparel, hood, and dress. With baseball bats in their hands, they pretended to be beating knelt pledges dressed as stereotyped blacks and Hispanics. They superimposed their lips, painted their skin black, wore bandanas around their heads, etc. Signs hanging on the walls behind them read, KKK all the way. Tech did not issue disciplinary action to the Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity until after minority student leaders formed a grievance committee and demanded the Dean of Students' office to review the case. After disciplinary action was announced, the fraternity appealed under the defense that it was a violation of their First Amendment right to free speech. The university lifted sanctions. Vice President of Student Affairs, Dr. Robert Ewalt, reasoned that if Tech pursued the case as, quote, hate speech in the courts, The university would lose astronomical amounts of money and funding due to individual lawsuits by fraternity members, their family members, all of their alumni and members of business networks affiliated with the fraternity throughout the country. Lupita, you wouldn't want tech to cease to exist, would you? He posed. In your groups, discuss, if you were in those shoes, what would you do? Oh, actually, both. Maybe half of you, thank you, that's good. Because that would be exploring two worldviews. There are two worldviews here in conflict. Let's keep it academic. Good point. So have a couple in your group, choose one worldview, and another couple, choose the other. 10 minutes. Okay, so what emerged in your conversations, Scott? Let me know if you'd like to share what emerged in your conversations. Raise your hand if you'd like to share. Okay, Scott. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think there was disbelief, like, really? And this is 1992. I mean, so I think we had to go through that. But then I think that one of the things that we talked about was the analogy with this about what's going on right now with domestic violence in the NFL. So we spent a lot of time talking about the two of those, and the whole, when you talk about advocacy or you talk about social justice or injustice, money seems to play a role. And so we talked a lot about those two analogies, so yeah.
Very good observation. It seems that that's usually the case, right? Anyone else like to share what emerged in your group or what resonated? Yes?
So we discussed the fact that this happened in the 90s, and so it was very different back then. Not necessarily views, but students didn't have as much power as they do now with social media and like the ability to go to the public very easily and make it a public issue, even if the administration of a school won't. And so we had a similar situation with the fraternity at Trinity University, and it had been an issue for years and years. It was with sexual assault, and it wasn't brought to light until like hundreds of students started stepping up and advocating for people who had been victims, but the people who were accused of attacking them were still on campus and had not been punished to the extent of the law. They were still living on campus and didn't have anything on their record. And so whenever students took the power and like worked really hard all of last year to make sure that our policies changed and also that the fraternity was punished, they're not allowed on campus for at least 5 years now. But it wasn't until last year when students actually started like making a lot of noise where change actually happened.
That's a good distinction to make. So the tools were different. We didn't have social media back then. And you're right, because voice, the louder and the more voices you can bring together, oh my gosh, that can be powerful, right? But it was a challenge back then because we didn't have social media. But that's great that you are able to utilize that now to affect change as you did in that situation with Trinity. Absolutely. Anyone else?
So did you organize the stand-in?
Oh, there's a little more, but I see you guys are anxious to see what happened. But before we get there, 1990s, that's right, this was in the 90s, not that long ago. Effects of institutional racism, call it for what it is, institutional racism. So tech students were asked to rate racial tensions on campus. This was my very first experience with this, and I've learned through the years working in the field of racism, sexisms, isms, this is always the case. Minority students rated racial tensions on campus as over 90%. Over 90%. Non-minority students rated racial tensions less than 50%. Why do you think that is?
Because the non-minorities aren't being affected by it.
The non-minorities are not really being affected by it. It's not really their reality.
If non-minority students were to acknowledge that there was more racial tension, then they'd also have to admit that they're the ones who are causing the tension.
Oh, I love your response. Yeah. Because with that comes responsibility and accountability, right? And admitting, oh, are we contributing to this? That takes courage, doesn't it? Of the 12 friends who began college with me, only 2 graduated. Although 614 black students enrolled at Tech in 1992, the total student population of the entire university is 25,000. 614 black students enrolled in 1992. Half dropped out by the end of the school year. (1992). So prejudice editorial surfaced on the university and city newspapers. What I mean by that is community members, students were writing about, what's the big deal? Kids are just having fun. Why are people speaking and getting upset about this? 1992, Talia Johnson was the most courageous woman I had ever met. Oh my God, we had never gone through this in this scale. And she ended up emerging as the spokesperson, the leader for all minority students on campus against a city and university that was saying a lot of scary things. Talia Johnson and I received threatening phone calls from alleged KKK members. I remember getting the phone call. Back then, we didn't have cell phones. And my phone was hooked up to my wall in my dorm room. You know, my mom would call, my sisters would call, friends, whatever. And I pick up the phone, I'm like, hello? It was at noon. And it's a male voice, and he says, hey, Lupita, you need to quiet down. Then he starts to tell me my schedule. He says, I know you have political science class at 8:30 a.m. at Holden Hall. I know you have such and such class. He told me all the places where I have my classes and said, if you don't keep quiet, I know where to find you. That was a little scary. My family was really concerned. They kept telling me, just keep quiet. Don't do anything. 1993, in my mass communications class, Dr. Dean told an Asian student, or called upon them and said, do the math because you all are good at it. 1994. So the university had this big international week, supposedly like to invite the different cultures and experience different cultures. It was just food. It was all about food. International Week's ads display offensive stereotypes. For example, I can see this cartoon character, but but it was an Asian man portrayed as having buck teeth, severely slanted eyes, bowl-shaped haircut, while holding a bowl filled with rice in one hand and chopsticks in the other, with a big, silly grin on his face. I was dating a Chinese guy at the time, and we formed the Asian American Student Association. We found out that of the 25,000 total student population, there are only 200 Asian. And I don't know what happened. Oh, there it is. Okay, the wrong button. 94, Texas Tech Dean for Minority Affairs Joshua Mora is forced to resign after university officials learn that he's gay. Isn't that crazy? I'm sorry. I'm stepping out of the worldview construct. That's just crazy. Tech University President Lawless writes a personal letter to a Lubbock resident on university letterhead stating how he's appalled by the university event hosting 2 gay men as speakers for the university lecture series organized by students. He added that such disappointment makes one reconsider professions. 96. English instructor assigns an offensive excerpt from One Source. That was the name of the book. It was my English class. And the excerpt was from Miami, which stated that in Miami, Spanish is not only heard from tree trimmers, but from business professionals. '97. During Professor Schiffer's political science lab discussion on immigration, oh, I remember this, an Anglo student asserts that we Americans should just place massive bombs on the borders and blow the Mexican immigrants up. I don't think the professor knew how to handle it. But I do remember the voice of that student saying it loud, boisterous, confident, as though it were no big deal. It was that it was right. It was right to do that. And the last one, Scott, I'm going to need your help to pass some more. Tech operator harasses and refuses service to a native Spanish-speaking student. Oh, maybe they're, oh, no, they don't. Okay. Okay, pass that. So Scott's gonna pass something out for you. I'll give you 5 minutes to read it. So I would have let you break into groups again, but we're running out of time a little bit, so I'm just going to tell you what happened. Is that okay? Okay.
Why did you leave?
I know, right? I know. I guess I have work to do, huh? So I want to read this quote. Paula Rothenberg. So I discovered her because I started to take for U.S. history, we were required to take a history class. And there was a course called Mexican Americans in U.S. history. And I was like, oh, I need to read up. And the professor, Professor Ramirez, he was hilarious, but he gave me so much validation to all that I was experiencing. He would even tell us, he's like, why do you think I wear a suit when I come teach? Because there weren't a lot of faculty minority either. He'd say, the first couple years I was teaching, I didn't wear my jacket, and they were asking me where the trash was, because they thought I was the janitor. He's like, I wear my jacket every day I come into this university. I don't want to be mistaken. Professor. Anyway, he introduced me to Paula Rothenberg. So I would recommend, I don't know if you already know this book, but it's my Bible. It became my Bible. It still is. I refer to it all the time. It's called Race, Class, and Gender in the United States. The author is Paula S. Rothenberg. She really was, in reading that book, I was able to put words to things that I was experiencing and fully understand the definition of prejudice, the definition of discrimination, classism, sexism, the way all of that influences policy, all of it. So I recommend it, highly recommend it. So what did I do? First, I was panicking. I came from a worldview where there's strong benevolence from having gone to Catholic school, Lutheran school. Everyone was about just loving each other because that's what we're supposed to do. That's what we're born for. And then I see this. I was shocked. So I drew from the short-lived life I had at that time, which was what, I was 20, 21. And I drew from my ancestors. Emiliano Zapata. Prefiero morir de pie a vivir de rodillas. I prefer to die standing than live on bended knee. And I went ahead and I added this picture because I think it's quite beautiful in that La Virgen de Guadalupe is there. And this is the Mexican Revolution. Cesar Chavez and his struggle, leading his cause. La Virgen de Guadalupe is right there. Okay. Crises. Two worldviews in complete conflict. So I started to think, what do I need to do here? I can't do this alone, take on an entire university. Just me. What do we need to do? And I knew there were a lot of us that were really upset, and I knew there was a lot that were telling us, keep quiet, what's the big deal? So I started to reach out, talk to folks that I felt shared the same worldview as I, which was fairness and benevolence. All the minority students that I felt shared the same views, immediately started organizing. So it was more about gathering your people tight, close and tight. Then I started to think about my times at Redeemer, Incarnate Word, and all the good white people that I had known early on. I had faith. There are good white people. I just need to find them. So I reached out, remembering liberation theology, which is exactly that. The notion that we're here to help the poor, to help those in need. So I reached out to people in the community that were religious, the Catholic diocese. And I knew that I had to gather as many people and groups that could align in this cause, because the one worldview that was the most difficult to have them join the cause was the economic and political. Like Dr. Ewald had said, we can't afford to challenge this. It may not be right morally, but the fact is. So this happened a long time ago, so forgive me, but I don't remember everybody's last names and accurate names, but these are the groups. So my friend and I, Miguel Bonilla, we founded a chapter of Mecha. Does anybody know what Mecha is? Yes. Scott, can you give them the mic, please? So there was not a chapter of Mecha, but we founded one back then. Yes.
Well, Mecha, when I went to college back east in the early 70s,
Yes.
Was Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanos de Aztlán. And so that's how I know Mecha.
What was their mission?
The mission was to bring together mostly Chicano, what we called in those days Chicano students that were at universities across the country, reflecting on what was happening earlier with our brethren that were African American, happening with SNCC, happening with other civil rights movements, looking at how do Chicanos in academic settings and students come together for common good. And that's how I knew Mecha.
Awesome. Yep. That was Mecha. Mecha was basically Mexican Americans standing up for political power and asserting justice. So we did a chapter, and our first meeting, there were 80 people that showed up. We were stunned. We were expecting 5. Oh, and it's really funny because my friend and I, to announce the meeting, we made flyers, and my friend is the most like Buddhist sweet guy ever, and he's very into arts. So he had paint, red paint, and he put it on his hand and put it on the paper, and then he's like, oh, look, let's make a red handprint. And the flyer read, stop now, become part of the solution. So stop the problem, become part of the solution. Come to our Mecha meeting, right? The word on the street was, there's a Mecha chapter. Did you see the blood on the flyers? They're so militant. Oh my gosh, it's like scandalous. So everybody on campus were afraid of us. And then one person went, have you met Lupita and Miguel? Like, it's not right. Doesn't match up. That was really funny. Okay. So the other organizations that we reached out to were OD5, Hispanic Fraternity, the Hispanic Society. We formed a Student Human Relations Task Force. They're the ones that did that survey. And then the Black students. We formed the Asian American Student Association, and then the Minority Faculty Association. They felt the same thing. I reached out to the community, city council. There was Victor Hernandez. He had gone to Tech Law School. He was very receptive to helping us. He started to become very vocal, as you read in the article. And then I don't remember the editor for El Editor, which was a Latino newspaper. Davita Doro, Catholic Diocese. Oh my God, she was amazing. Her and I would also organize a lot of Cesar Chavez walks and events. The last 2, I want to tell you, this was community organizing from 1992 to 1997. This wasn't just 1 year. Networking, building community, trying to strategize, try one thing, it doesn't work, try another thing, it still doesn't work. Keep trying different avenues, strategies. The thing that finally clicked, so Chris Alvarado, I had met at a Mecha conference. He became assistant to a Texas state legislator. He read one of those articles, and a couple of other articles. There was a few articles coming out because there's a lot of things like that coming from Texas Tech. And he called me, said, tell me all that's going on. So I told him. He reported it to the legislator. She called the president of the university and said, that sounds very familiar. And she told him, is this really happening? That's an issue, because guess what? The state funds Texas Tech University. Cha-ching! Money is now an issue. What do you think the president did? He called me By this time, he knew who I was, because I was always in the paper or saying something or trying to do. He called me in. I have to say that as this was happening, the Minority Faculty Association was working really hard, meeting with the Board of Regents, telling them that we need an Office of Diversity. There's only one black Board of Regent at that time, and I think he was doing all he could, but there was a lot of resistance. So there are a few things that were happening all at the same time. I cannot take full credit for this at all. It took so many people and so many agitations and activities to raise the level of awareness. I wish we had social media back then. So we basically gave him a list of policies we wanted implemented. Office of Diversity, yes, of course. Sensitivity training for staff, of course. There needs to be for incoming freshmen, multicultural course. We had a huge list, I forget half the stuff, but guess what? A lot of it was implemented. Today, so in 1997, the Office for Diversity finally was established. And its present day, it's grown into the Division of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. And we don't have to go to the website. So that was pretty good. Something happened. But it took a lot of people organizing and putting pressure. Any thoughts? Questions? She's glad I stayed. It was exhausting. Oh, what? The microphone's coming.
Oh. I'm curious about the people who were showing you resistance and what their situations when they went home, how if they ever internalized anything that was going on with you guys, like the people who were trying to fight for what's right versus they're trying to fight to keep their funding. Like, did this potentially affect their life, you know, and their family and anybody maybe asking them, you know, what's going on and maybe if they had college-age kids as well,
if they had what?
If they had college-age kids as well, if there was any type of conversation going on about why things were. I'm just kind of wondering about their world, like what was going on there. So
That's a good question, and I really don't know. But in all my experience, even doing advocacy work in New York City and DC, I have learned that there in the political world and around campaigns and things, we talk about concentrating on the movable middle. The movable middle. What does that mean? People that are on the fence. I don't know if I'm going to vote this way or that way. You know what? Because they can be influenced, right? Then you have people that are really dead set on one or the other because that's just their reality. So I find that you need to use different tools and strategies. When you're in the movable middle, what are you going to communicate to them? The mission is educating them, right? Hey, did you know this? You know, or this is the effect, or this is whatever, right? And then you hope they'll make, you know, a valid decision or a good decision. The other polar opposites, it's really hard to convince them one way or another. So if you're really, really fighting for your cause, who was it over here that said, usually comes down to money? Yeah. But don't lose hope because you know what? There is a lot of power in organizing. Look at the dreamers. They don't have a lot of money. But boy, they are so strategic, so well organized. And they're having sit-ins right now at legislators' offices in DC as we speak. Like they're all over the place, very well organized. So it's not always about money. It helps, definitely helps. Okay.
One of the things that we had talked about earlier and I found interesting, and I think it goes into maybe using some of the tools, is that, so this is one case study of a school in the early 90s, but I went to the school in the later 90s, and I knew I've learned throughout the years of kind of different cells where this happened, where institutions were now being challenged because they had a growing number of minority students, but the schools, academia didn't quite know how to react to them. And so just anecdotally offhand from friends that I know that have gone to schools throughout the country, this was happening in quite a number of schools throughout the early 90s. In particular, in my case, I know a lot of Latino students and a lot of MedCheck groups that organized around this time. And those tools that we have today were not available then. So I know that they weren't necessarily familiar with things that were going on elsewhere. Right. But something to kind of compare it to is now what's happening with sexual violence in schools. That's what I'm seeing more of, and these different, I guess, cells that are happening, and they're now more connected and allowing different groups that maybe 30 years ago would not have been connected, but are now allowing that connection. So kind of using that power in numbers has been really interesting to see when you compare the two.
Scott just told me I have, oh yeah.
Well, and I also wanted to say, speaking of that, that in the NFL case now, there was, and I forget the woman's name, who started the hashtag Why I Stayed. And, I think speaking to the social media, I think that is just a tool now that advocacy, nonprofits really need to take advantage of, because the power behind that, you saw that with the Big Give. Those of you that participated in the fundraising day, most of that was driven by social media. So now as we build and train you guys on the social media and you build your tribe, your network, remember to utilize that in your advocacy efforts when you're working in Austin and beyond.
Okay, I'm running out of time, but I really want to make sure I hit the things I really want. Okay, we already talked about it. I'm going to skip this. Lupita, I'm going to need a video here shortly. So Gifts of Adversity. This is a great book, by the way, by Norman Rosenthal. Deficit. When you suffer a deficit, you get insight and strength in other areas. Suffering brings empathy. Trauma, the gift of trauma is post-traumatic growth, which is described as not only do you survive, you flourish. Obstacles, if you are faced with obstacles, guess what? You get more creative. Remember my dad figuring out, okay, I can't get a loan, I don't have credit, I'm an immigrant. How do I go about this? Setbacks gives you wisdom. Malala, she said, the terrorists thought they would change my aims and stop my ambitions, but nothing changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage were born. Awesome. So keys to handling adversity. Accept that adversity occurred. Analyze the situation, plan your response, and cultivate good habits to stabilize physiology. Let me see. When I was there at Texas Tech, it was extremely stressful. There were times I was like sleepless nights with all the stress and trying to figure out what am I going to do next because this isn't working. It's really important to take a step back and take care of yourself, your mind, your spirituality. It's very important. These are the times to grow our souls. Each of us is called upon to embrace the conviction that despite the powers and principalities bent on commodifying all our human relationships, we have the power within us to create the world anew. I'm going to skip this and email this to you, okay? These are just tools you can find online, but these are tools that I appreciate. Pay special attention to Insight Philanthropy. It's a video. It'll show you what it does. I'll send it to you. I'm going to skip over most of this too. So I was wanting to make sure to speak to you on an individual
Welcome to Philanthropy Insight, the Foundation Center's data visualization platform.
I don't need that. So I want to make sure, where was I going with this? Oh, I was speaking to you on an individual basis, but now the assessment part is speaking to an organization. So the things that you need to have to be able to strongly do advocacy as an organization. I also have to say, this quote is from somebody in San Antonio. This is from the San Antonio Area Foundation. So Sandy says, we have received a lot of positive feedback from the nonprofits who took the CCAT. Many have shared that the CCAT has been the catalyst for a frank conversation between board and staff about the agency's strengths and weaknesses. I love this tool, and I'm certified in this tool. So if any of you ever want to take it for your organization, let me know. It's a great organizational assessment, and it allows you to see in a very metrics-driven way, like where you need some strengthening. So it's a great tool. And then you can get capacity building grants, which the San Antonio Foundation gives. This same consulting firm has an advocacy core capacity assessment tool, which is basically the same thing. I'm going to skip over all that because short for time. You could also go on to the San Antonio Area Foundation website and take a peek at that. Life is very short, and what we have to do must be done in the now. So the summary for advocacy: stay grounded and resilient, nourish your values and worldviews, reframe adversity. There's always going to be obstacles. Define the issue, build your A-team. Absolutely important. Keep your eye on the goal. Okay, I want Hala back. Lupita, the first one, please. Wow, if I could live my life that way, just say, I want, and it appears.
Look at them. Time thieves.
That's not it.
Stealing a second, a minute,
Commercial.
an entire day. But honestly, they wouldn't even have to steal it because you're happy to give it to them. Save what little time you have with store pickup from Target.
Oh, you're gonna get arrested. I'm not leaving your side. My plans are done for tonight. I'm escorting you to the police station.
Sexual harassment happens in all kinds of places.
Yo, man, let me get those digits.
It happens in the workplace, it happens in the home, it happens in schools. And yet in those environments, we have a lot more protections in place. But on the street, it's like the wild, wild west. I'm Emily May, Executive Director of Hala Back. Hala Back is an international movement to address street harassment or sexual harassment that happens in public space. Tal Nguyen was riding the subway. A man sat down across from her, started to publicly masturbate, and Tal, not knowing what to do, pulled out her newfangled cell phone camera, because this is 2005, and took his picture exclusively with the idea of taking it to the police. But when she took it to the police were like, sorry, there's nothing we can do. And so she put it on Flickr, the photo sharing site. From there, it went viral, made it to the front cover of the New York Daily News, and started this citywide conversation about public masturbation. And we thought to ourselves, why don't we create something on these newfangled things called blogs, where everybody can do what Tal Nguyen did.
I saw you harassing that woman back there.
We wanted it to actually take the focus off of the woman and onto the harasser. We wanted to turn that lens, right? Because when you're being harassed, if the lens is on you, we wanted to turn it back around and put it onto them.
Yeah, you need to stop harassing women.
We collected stories and photographs, and that was, the basis of the blog. It was very, very simple. And then we started to see a couple other trends happen in technology. We can map your story, tweet your story, Facebook your story, and we started to see apps.
Do you know it's not acceptable to talk to a woman you don't know like that?
And it's this compilation of stories that is really changing the way that we talk about street harassment and changing the way that we talk about all forms of day-to-day discrimination. And I think it's changing the way that social movements happen.
This is not our way of not being able to take a compliment. this is an issue of safety.
It was October of 2010, and the city held its first ever hearing on street harassment. And not just New York City's first ever hearing on street harassment, but the world's first ever hearing on street harassment.
Vulgar, aggressive language toward women, especially when they are with their children, is highly inappropriate.
And so we were surrounded by a standing room only crowd of folks, like every single news channel. It was a huge to-do. And so the thing that they walked out of it with is an understanding, among other things, that we really needed to do more research. We had this idea, why don't we take our iPhone and our Droid apps and connect them up with the city's 311 information line. And it really is creating the first government response to street harassment. What we're seeing is it's really related to population density. So the more people in a given space, the more likely you are to be harassed. For so many people, that's really surprising because it shows us that this isn't a race thing, it's not a class thing, that this is an everyone thing. Hollaback is a nonprofit. We really wanted to run it like a movement. And as a movement, we wanted to give these leaders around the world resources and a community and all the support and technical assistance that we could provide. We totally embrace the fact that street harassment might be solved differently in India than it might be in Buenos Aires or in Canada. And we just wanted to give people options and give people a toolkit and menu. Culture changes every single day. We went from a culture 60 years ago of having different water fountains for people of color, and now we have a culture where we have our first Black president. And so who's saying that we can't change the culture that has made street harassment okay? And I have a 10-year agenda, a 10-year plan of all the baby girls that I see rolling around on the street. I want to make sure that they grow up in a world knowing that street harassment is not okay, that it's no longer a question, that they have no clue who I am because I'm completely irrelevant because we solved the problem.
I love Hollaback. Isn't that amazing? And I'm so proud to say, so I helped them through their very first strategic planning, and then they called me back for the second year for the second strategic planning process. They're kicking butt. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm being recorded, sorry. I'm just really proud. I think they're doing amazing work. Again, to what we spoke about earlier about social media, they've really taken it to the max, right? They're really utilizing it. They're all over the world. Guess what? You don't need a huge team of 1,000 people or more, to do the work. You can use social media to do the networking and connecting. It's about community. Okay, next video, please.
I feel so sorry for people who are not living in Detroit. People are always striving for size, to be a giant. And this is a symbol of how giants fall. Keep recognizing that reality is changing and that your ideas have to change. Don't get stuck in old ideas.
Grace has made more contributions to the Black struggle than most Black people have.
How did you become a philosopher?
I'll just go back 70 years. I'm not sure why I am who I am. I think it does have something to do with the fact that I was born female and born Chinese.
Folks didn't really think about Grace as a Chinese American. She was Grace, she was just one of us.
I think the light bulb goes on very often in conversations that people have, and we don't pay attention to it.
Talk is cheap. I find it very, very difficult to take. I want to tell you honestly, their talk was not cheap.
Oh, God, she made all kinds of people cry. Myself included. Grace, how would you describe where we stand now?
One of the difficulties when you're coming out of oppression is that you get a concept of the Messiah. You have to get to that point that we are the leaders we've been looking for. We are the children of Martin and Malcolm. I don't know what the next American Revolution is going to be like, but you might be able to imagine it if your imagination were rich enough.
I love her too. Life is not what you alone make it. Life is the input of everyone who touched your life and every experience that entered it. We're all part of one another. Anybody recognize them? Her? It's Hollaback. That's when they were doing part of their strategic planning. Do you recognize her? The woman in the subway. Anybody recognize her? It's me and my mama. I'm going to close with this, these words from Grace Lee Boggs. It's going to take about 3 minutes. But I think what she says here is very important, so I want to share this with you, and we'll close. If you want to stay and ask questions, feel free. I was privileged to participate in the great humanizing movements of the last century, but I can't recall a time when the issues were so basic, so interconnected. I believe that we're at the point now in the United States where a movement is beginning to emerge. I think that the calamity of the Iraq War, the outsourcing of jobs, the dropout of young people from the education system, the monstrous growth of the prison industrial complex, the planetary emergency, which we are engulfed at the present moment, is demanding that instead of just complaining about these things, instead of just protesting about these things, we begin to look for and hope for another way of living. And I think that that's where the movement is. I see a movement beginning to emerge because I see hope beginning to trump despair. The struggle we're dealing with these days, which I think is part of what the 60s represented, is how do we define our humanity? In order to grapple with the interacting and seemingly intractable questions of today's society, we need to see ourselves not mainly as victims, but as new men and women who, recognizing the sacredness in ourselves and in others, can view love and compassion not as some sentimental weakness, but as the key that somehow unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. How are we going to make our livings in a society becoming increasingly jobless because of high tech and outsourcing? Where will we get the imagination to recognize that for most of human history, the concept of jobs didn't even exist? Work, as distinguished from labor, was done to produce needed goods and services, develop skills and artistry, and nurture cooperation. What will move us to care for our biosphere instead of using our technological mastery to increase the speed at which we are making it uninhabitable? How do we redefine education so that the 30-50% of inner city children do not drop out of school, thus ensuring that millions will end up in prison? Can we build an America in which people of all races and ethnicities live together in harmony? And Euro-Americans, in particular, celebrate their role as one among many minorities constituting the multi-ethnic majority? How do we achieve reconciliation with the 2/3 of the world that increasingly resents our economic, military, and cultural domination? These are the times to grow our souls Each of us is called upon to embrace the conviction that despite the powers and principalities bent on commodifying all our human relationships, we have the power within us to create the world anew. We can begin by doing small things at the local level, like planting community gardens or looking out for our neighbors. That's how change takes place in living systems, not from above, but from within. From many local actions occurring simultaneously. We never know how our small activities will affect others through the invisible fabric of our connectedness. In this exquisitely connected world, it's never a question of critical mass. It's always about critical connections. People are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. We need a vision that recognizes that we're at one of the great turning points in human history, when the survival of our planet and the restoration of our humanity requires a great sea change in our ecological, economic, political, and spiritual value. Rebellions tend to be negative, to denounce and expose the enemy without providing a positive vision of a new future. A revolution is not just for the purpose of correcting past injustices. A revolution involves a projection of man, woman into the future. It begins with the projecting the notion of a more humane human being. Example, a human being who is more advanced in the specific qualities which only human beings have: creativity, consciousness, and self-consciousness, a sense of political and social responsibility. I think we're not looking sufficiently at what is happening at the grassroots in the country. We've not emphasized sufficiently the cultural revolution that we have to make among ourselves in order to force the government to do differently. Things do not start with government. People think of evolution mainly in terms of anatomical changes. I think that we have to think of evolution in terms of very elemental human changes. And so we're evolving both through our knowledge and through our experiences to another stage of humankind. So revolution and evolution are no longer so separate. Do something local. Do something real, however small. And don't diss the political things, but understand their limitations. It takes a whole lot of things. It takes people doing things. It takes people talking about things. It takes dialogue. It takes changing the whole lot of ways by which we think. I think we have to rethink the concept of leader, because leader implies follower. And so many, not so many, but I think we need to appropriate, embrace the idea that we are the leaders that we've been looking for. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lupita.